going to be giving a series of 4 lectures around issues of urban space and gender. This one this evening is today on Wednesday. The rest of them, however, will be on Thursday mornings at 10 o'clock and will, as it were, occupy the first part of what is essentially designed as the sort of third-year course on the analysis of space. Though having said that, I want to make it absolutely clear that everyone's extremely welcome to come. Many of you will remember Elizabeth speaking at the conference on politics of space a couple of years ago, and her writings on gender, the city, and on sexuality are well known to most of you, and to some extent by fiction. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening to give this talk. Thank you.
Okay, that's the mic's working all right, isn't it? Yeah. As Mark says, I'll be giving 4 lectures on the subject of urban space, and they're organised around 3 concepts, rather inconveniently. They're organised around the concepts heterotopia, dystopia, and utopia. And today I'm going to talk about heterotopia and the subjective experience of space. And within the context of these 3 related views of the city, I'll be looking at how urban space is variably experienced by men and women, racial and sexual minorities. And I shall bring the subjective experience of urban living to the fore. This is rather in contrast with the emphasis on large-scale planning of the earlier post-war years. And in fact, it reflects a change in the way in which theorists have written about the city in recent years, and I'll be talking about some of those theorists in a minute. By contrast with the grandiose rhetoric of writers and architects such as Le Corbusier and assorted geographers, sociologists, urban planners, architects and cultural critics of, well, perhaps not so much cultural critics, but certainly architects and planners in the earlier post-war period, writers today are more likely to write in a personal, sometimes autobiographical way about their experience of living in the city or in urban space, and then tend more to move from that personal subjective experience towards attempts to theorize it. Rather than trying to make life fit their plans, they plan perhaps more humbly in a way around the kinds of lives that people actually live. Urban space, or the city, I think there's another whole series of lectures, or several books probably, to be written about the relationship of film and the city. Many films have simply used urban locations or urban studio sets for that matter, perhaps fairly unreflectively, as the backdrop for narrative. On the other hand, there are many other films that have engaged with urban life in ways that are extremely interesting and often aesthetically beautiful, and we may perhaps be looking at some of those in other lectures. Now, in my first lecture, I propose, as I said, to discuss the city as heterotopia. And in following lectures, I shall discuss dystopia and utopia, and then in the final lecture, we'll return to the idea of heterotopia and look at it anew and in a different way, particularly in relation to Los Angeles. But now, first, I want to talk about some examples of the way in which writers have combined autobiographical and theoretical writing to reach a new understanding of the experience of urban life. And I'm going to talk, first of all, about a recent attempt, a very engaging recent attempt in this direction by Franois Maspero, who was formerly a left-wing publisher in France, and then more recently, a couple of years ago, wrote this book called Roissy Express. And Roissy, of course, is the village or the enclave where the new airport, the Charles de Gaulle airport, is situated, and it's one of the Parisian suburbs. Maspero, a Parisian himself, begins with a lament for the decline or passing of the old central Paris he knew. Now, Paris is, as I'm sure you know, unlike London or Los Angeles for that matter, or many other places, in that it has always been central Paris that has contained the smart districts. But Paris also remained, until much more recently than London, a city in which different classes lived side by side in many, if not most, of these central districts. Unlike London and most English and American cities, Paris didn't develop a middle-class suburbia, or not to the same extent. Instead, around the edges of the city, there grew up shanty towns and municipal housing schemes that provided homes for the working class and immigrants. Thus, Paris, you could really say that Paris was rather the opposite of London in many ways. But in recent years, Paris too has changed. And Maspero's book is an important attempt to get away from the predominant, very negative image of the Parisian suburbs towards a new vision of the city. With a photographer friend, he decided to take a trip to these suburbs of Paris. And speaking of himself and his companion, he writes, that's he and his companion, they discovered that many Parisians saw the suburbs as a shapeless muddle, a desert containing 10 million inhabitants, a series of indistinct grey buildings, a circular purgatory with Paris as paradise in the middle, and I suppose the périphérique, the road that goes round, the motorway that goes round inner Paris, would be the kind of limbo between the heaven and the hell. The suburbs, he says, were something all around, a wasteland, a land for wasting souls, a landscape which had been delivered in bulk, a bit of a wreck forever in the process of reconstruction. And then he goes, because these suburbs, I mean, it's not like suburban in the way we think of it, obviously as kind of drearily, I don't know, sort of lower middle class or some horrid snobbish way of looking at it, but as extremely impoverished and rather dangerous. But then he goes on to talk about the way in which the real Paris, that's to say the centre, has changed. Being Parisians, and he's referring to himself and his friend again, they themselves had for years watched their bustling quartier being slowly transformed into museum-style shop windows. They had watched the departure of an entire class of craftsmen, workers, and small shopkeepers, all the people who went to make up a Paris street. They themselves had hung on, but saw renovation force out the poorly off old people and young couples with their children, who all disappeared as rents rose and flats were sold. Where did all these people go? To the outskirts, to the suburbs. Paris had become a business hypermarket and a cultural Disneyland. Where had the life gone? To the suburbs. All around, therefore, could not be a wasteland, but a land full of people and life, real people and real life. The only wasting souls they knew were those they saw and felt on their city's every street corner. And if Paris had emptied, if it was no more than a ghost town, didn't that mean that the true centre was now all around? And the book is his story of their journey through the suburbs. They started off at Roissy and go on one step on the train, one stop on the train every day, and they get off at the next stop and walk all around these various areas and explore them, meet people there, and so on. So this is really a very engaging and unusual kind of book. And it's the story of their discovery of the real world behind the stereotype of all these municipal concrete housing schemes, sink estates or the equivalent armies of sort of Algerians and other immigrants and so on, drug addicts and all the rest of it. This is told in an unashamedly subjective and personal way. So we've moved a long way from the urban planning discourse of the earlier post-war period, when both suburbs and centre city slums were denounced in grandiose, paternalistic and authoritarian style, and planners wanted to build utopias from scratch. And in fact, Godard did make a film about the suburbs, 2 or 3 things that I know about her, which I think really fell into this kind of rather negative view of these huge estates on the outskirts and so on. Another French, I think this trend in French literature ultimately comes from Henri Lefebvre, who I propose not to discuss actually, but who wrote about the sociology of everyday life. But another French writer, Michel De Certeau, has a similar approach, although his work is more theoretical than that of Maspero. In his essay, Walking in the City, Certeau's starting point is his own observation from the top of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. I must say, one notices that these writings are always about the more glamorous cities in the world. We don't get books written about Luton or Ipswich or something like that. Or Des Moines, Iowa, or somewhere like that. De Certeau contrasts this panoptic view, the view of the all-seeing eye, with the actual daily experience of the pedestrian at street level. And again, that could be the contrast between the two approaches. He likens the pedestrian's daily weaving through the streets as a kind of language or enunciation or rhetoric. Individuals have their styles of walking, that's to say not their physical movements as such, but their ways of negotiating a path through the city, a way of operating in urban space. Now, De Certeau develops this metaphor at some length, and I'm not absolutely sure how convincing it is. I mean, that might be something you might like to think about. How similar are pedestrian movements, pedestrian trajectories? How similar really are they to a language? There's a kind of intuitive similarity, but I doubt whether it's a really close analogy. But it is worth noticing as a means of trying to map the ways in which the presence and movement of pedestrians, which are all separately determined and yet mesh into a kind of web of movements all over a city, actually alter the built environment and affect our experience of it. We tend to take for granted the presence of people in the streets, and anyone who's been in a city very early in the morning when streets are deserted will know that empty streets constitute an entirely different, not to say quite eerie experience. Yet the discourse of city planning and architecture has often treated the city as a work of art, a finished object apart from its human inhabitants who are kind of irrelevant to it in some sense. In a more general sense, De Certeau seems to regard pedestrian movement and the use the pedestrian makes of the city as a particular example of something that interests him a great deal. That's the idea of consumption as resistance. Now again, this notion, I think the idea that one is a consumer of the city is itself perhaps not quite the way we usually think about it. But this notion of resistance is rather characteristic of postmodern thought. Theorists have moved from the grand theoretical schemas of liberal and Marxist sociology, and instead of talking about the state or creating grand edifices of theory claiming to give a general explanation of society, they emphasize aspects of daily life which were often disregarded in the grand theories of earlier sociologists, though not always. That's perhaps too much of a generalization. Of course, among the grand theories that have disappeared is the Marxist notion of political revolution, the overturning of the social order and its replacement by an entirely new order. And I think that to an extent the idea of resistance is what has replaced this. Yet I think De Certeau, and he's not the only one, still reveals a Marxist heritage, since the notion of resistance was evident in Gramsci's writings on hegemony. Gramsci distinguished between a war of maneuver and a war of position, the first being a more frontal attack by radical forces, whereas the war of position is a more passive, say, a kind of siege mentality, a strategy to be used in a situation in which outright revolution is not on the cards. I think that's the right way around. I'm always sort of anxious whether I have got it the right way around, but I think that is the right way around. The postmodern notion of resistance is even less than this, even less than the war of position. De Certeau writes of pedestrians as one kind of consumer. Pedestrians do, of course, in a sense, consume, that's they use the city. A city that has not been constructed by or even for them, because urban space, the construction of urban space is ultimately determined by considerations of real estate, property development, macroeconomic change and so on. Yet De Certeau's line on this is that consumers turn products to their own ends, and this is a line that's taken by many writers in the area of cultural studies. I mean, it applies to television and so on as well. De Certeau writes that he wishes to make explicit the systems of operational combination which also compose a culture, and he wishes to bring to light the models of action characteristic of users whose status as the dominated element in society, they're subordinate, although this status does not mean that they are either passive or docile, is concealed by the euphemistic term consumers. So he concedes that the idea of consumers and consumption is a kind of euphemism in a sense which hides the extent to which consumers don't have power. We always hear about how consumers are the powerful ones. They determine a whole lot of things. But he rejects that view. But then he says everyday life invents itself by poaching in countless ways on the property of others. So De Certeau's picture of contemporary society is essentially of an authoritarian and undemocratic one, in which the majority have little or no power to determine production. Systems of production, such as television, urban development and commerce, determine what shall be produced. What interests De Certeau is the use consumers make of the products with which they are confronted. He writes, to a rationalized, expansionist, and at the same time centralized, clamorous, and spectacular production corresponds another production called consumption. The latter is devious, it is dispersed, but it insinuates itself everywhere, silently and almost invisibly, because it does not manifest itself through its own products, but rather through its ways of using the products imposed by a dominant economic order. And then he goes on to talk about an example, and the example he gives is not a modern urban one at all. It's the example of the conquered American Indians in Peru and Mexico, who were conquered by the Spaniards. They submitted to the new ways of thought and life that the Spaniards imposed, I suppose Christianity and so on. they did not reject them or even alter them. But, he says, by using them with respect to ends and reference foreign to the system they had no choice but to accept, they kind of subtly subverted them. They were other within the very colonization that outwardly assimilated them. Their use of the dominant social order deflected its power, which they lacked the means to challenge. They escaped without leaving it. I suppose what we might call today internal exile. The strength of their difference lay in procedures of consumption, though he doesn't say how. To a lesser degree, a similar ambiguity creeps into our societies through the use made by the common people of the culture disseminated and imposed by the elites producing the language. And what interests De Certeau is the way in which consumers use products in this subversive fashion. As unrecognized producers, he says, poets of their own acts, silent discoverers of their own paths in the jungle of functionalist rationality, consumers produce, through their signifying practices, something different and other than what was intended. In the technocratically constructed, written and functionalized space in which consumers move about, their trajectories form unforeseeable sentences, partly unreadable paths across a space. Although they are composed of vocabularies of established languages, those of TV, newspapers, supermarkets, or museum sequences, and although they remain subordinated to the prescribed syntactical forms, I mean, he's just carrying on this analogy of a language, so the syntactical forms become schedules, the way in which space is formally organized, and so on. These trajectories by consumers, their resistance, traces out the ruses of other interests and desires that are neither determined nor captured by the systems in which they develop. And I mean, I think what he means is, I mean, just to give a couple of examples, I don't know how many of you saw at the end of last year a program about supermarkets on, I think, BBC Two, which largely consisted of how people met their future husbands or wives in supermarkets. The supermarket as pick-up ground, which I'm sure isn't what Sainsbury's and Asda initially imagined, but it appears that there are all sorts of codes and ways in which supermarkets are used for pick-up grounds, and Camden Town Sainsbury's Friday night is gay night, for example, I've been told. Well, I'll just give three examples. The second example is a less attractive one in a way. I remember walking through a sort of very twee council estate in Camden, one of these sort of new ones where there are all little closes and cul-de-sacs and cottages and so on, with my daughter, who was then a toddler, and one of these cosy little corners that was supposed to be kind of vaguely rural or garden city in the middle had obviously become the place where you scored, and when I intruded there with this toddler, I was very unwelcome indeed and was sort of run out of the estate, basically. And the third example is museums or art galleries as pick-up grounds again. And I was going to show you a short extract from a film, Dressed to Kill, which some of you may remember. About 15 years ago, Dressed to Kill became very controversial because a number of feminists, it was a slasher movie, a number of feminists felt it, victimized women, and women were seen as victims, and numerous women in this film were murdered in a very horrible way. Actually, I thought it was a very interesting film about male sexuality and its problems, but there is a sort of, that's really, by the way, I could give a whole lecture on Dressed to Kill, but I won't. There is this sequence in which the woman played by Angie Dickinson, who does subsequently get murdered, picks up this man in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But I don't think it would have been very appropriate for this lecture on Heterotopia, because I think that was that film was much more part of a very dystopian view of New York as a sort of unlivable city, really. But what is interesting is that last time I was in New York, I happened to read a newspaper article in which it turned out that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has now recognized this function of the museum, and they have single nights in the cafe. So it's sort of become, the resistance has become, Main Street has become kind of commercialized, commoditized in a sense. So I thought that was rather interesting. Well, I don't know about that. I hope not. But I'm not sure in what sense you mean, actually. Well, I think just the point is that obviously, there are lots of places in New York, Manhattan, where single people meet, heterosexually or homosexually. I think the interesting fact that the museum has cottoned on to this, and has made something that was informal and which perhaps De Certeau might have given as an example of this sort of resistance or the unofficial usage of space. It's turned it into an official and presumably, hopefully, profit-making use of the space that was previously used in an unofficial sense. So, well, presumably they hope so, yes. But anyway, to get back to De Certeau recognizes that however much consumers subvert the intention of producers, it's still the producers who have the whip hand, and I suppose the Met would be an example of that. De Certeau distinguishes between the strategy of the producers and the tactics of the consumers. Strategy is more grand scale. It's what you have when you have the power to commandeer certain spaces as your own. Well, just to go back to your point, of course, the ultimate point would be perhaps Sainsbury's will introduce sort of coffee evenings for singles or something. Strategy is what you have when you have the power to commandeer certain spaces as your own. Strategy becomes possible when you can then define the uses to which those spaces may be put. And this control also gives the powerful control over time as well as space, in the sense that when you have your own space, your own territory, you can use it, among other things, to plan for the future as well as the present. The spaces of power are also spaces of knowledge, or spaces in which knowledge can be accumulated and developed. Spaces, moreover, in which power can also, and frequently does, take the form of surveillance and panopticism. Tactics, on the other hand, are what may be used by those without the power to define a space as their own. A tactic, says De Certeau, insinuates itself into the other's place, fragmentarily, without taking it over in its entirety, without being able to keep it at a distance. It has at its disposal no base where it can capitalize on its advantages, prepare its expansions, and secure independence with respect to circumstances. A tactic has no place and therefore depends on time or seizing the opportunity. A tactic is something, a kind of thinking on your feet, really. It's always on the watch for opportunities that must be seized on the wing. Whatever it wins, it may not keep. It must constantly manipulate events in order to turn them into opportunities. And many everyday practices, says De Certeau, talking, reading, moving about, shopping, cooking, and so on, are tactical in character. And a good deal of sort of common or garden crime, I imagine, opportunistic crime, is essentially tactical. And so, more generally, he says, are many ways of operating, victories of the weak over the strong, clever tricks, knowing how to get away with things. So, in this way, curiously, but in a manner rather typical of a lot of postmodern thought, De Certeau implicitly retains the Marxist model of an oppressive economic and political system, yet forgoes the possibility of its overthrow, or of any opposition, save this notion of the devious, hidden opposition of the finally conquered. I suppose one could say that that's also a rather anarchistic kind of valorization, romanticization, perhaps, of the kind of rebellion that habitually sort of takes the form of petty crime, deviance of one transgression. Yet De Certeau is also of the opinion that in our societies, as local stabilities break down, it is as if, no longer fixed by a circumscribed community, tactics wander out of orbit, making consumers into immigrants in a system too vast to be their own, too tightly woven for them to escape from it. But as this happens, the strategic model is defeated by its own success. Well, what he means by this, really, is that previous models of power, such as the state, assumed that there was something else as well, that there were parts of society that escaped the state and the domination of the powerful. But now the power of production is everywhere. And yet, ironically, or then he goes into perhaps a rather romantic view of cyberspace and so on, ironically this means that eventually it may become simply the location for a cybernetic society which escapes control. I mean, I haven't sort of fully drawn out that argument, but it seems to sort of rest on a rather this sort of view of the internet as somehow belonging to everybody and sort of outside control. Now, De Certeau's rather romantic conception of the power, however circumscribed, of the consumer as a form of resistance is a rather prevalent one. And I think we should remember that women have traditionally really been seen as consumers. I mean, I'm not going to say any more about that at this moment, but I think it's interesting that somehow the consumer now has somehow lost this feminine identity. But as I said earlier, De Certeau is by no means the only writer to have emphasized the importance of subjective experience. To write about the city seems particularly to provoke theorists into autobiographical and descriptive modes. Richard Sennett, for example, who's written numerous works about urban life and its effect on human behavior and culture, described in a relatively recent book called The Conscience of the Eye, the walk he frequently takes from his home in Greenwich Village to 14th Street, which is the symbolic cut-off point between what was once the more working-class immigrant section of downtown Manhattan and the more commercial sector. And he describes with relish 14th Street itself as a multicultural market and centre for bargains, haggling, and hanging out. Now, Richard Sennett is a disciple of Jane Jacobs, who was one of the first to mount an all-out critique of post-war planning, publishing in 1961 The Death and Life of American Cities. In this very influential book, she attacked large-scale planning, the pulling down of old neighborhoods, and the construction of vast housing estates, industrial zoning, and the like, and was thus possibly a postmodernist before postmodernism in a way. Now, her critique was in fact partly triggered by the fact that Greenwich Village, where she also was living, was then under threat from the developers. Still a truly village-like enclave in the grid system of Manhattan, it sort of escapes the grid system. It still in the 50s housed a mixed community of working people, Italians and other immigrants, though not very many blacks, artisans, as well as being the intellectual and artistic center of New York, home to aspiring bohemians, writers, beats, experimental theater groups, performance artists and painters. It had an extremely vibrant theatrical and artistic community. And in fact, Greenwich Village was saved, although of course it has since become a much more upmarket district, illustrating the fate of all such districts, which tend, like Chelsea or Hampstead in London, or Montmartre or Montparnasse in Paris, to move from bohemian usage to become fashionable and expensive. I think a very recent example would be London Fields in Hackney, which has become a centre of artistic, the centre of an artistic community, partly squatting in old houses, but also using them as art galleries and art centres and so on. And now Hackney Council proposes to demolish those. I mean, for a rather different reason. That is not exactly gentrification. It's more the result of zoning, because this is zoned as an industrial area, and Hackney Council wish to destroy the houses and turn it into an area of small factories, or I don't know quite what they think will happen there, but they hope they'll make some money out of it, I suppose. So these things continue, these things still go on. Though normally the arrival of artists would often be the beginning of a gentrification process, actually. So perhaps Hackney, though interesting, is rather untypical. Now, in Jane Jacobs' critique, you find the introduction of a gender dimension, although she's a woman, it's only an implicit gender dimension, into the post-war planning debate. In emphasizing the life of the Greenwich Village street, its multifarious uses, the safety of children, because there were always shopkeepers, older people, and other street habitués who would recognize and watch out for individual children. And in emphasizing the safety also for women, or indeed for everyone, of streets which were used for a variety of different purposes at different times of day. Jane Jacobs brought back to the debate not only the individual, but a series of, as it were, domestic concerns neglected by utopian planners such as Le Corbusier or Abercrombie in this country, who, even when they claimed, as Le Corbusier certainly did, to have produced a plan that would enhance family life and which placed domestic life and chores at its centre, were authoritarian and relied on a conservative view of relations between men and women, confining women to the domestic sphere. This confinement of women to the home was also characteristic of post-war planning in, say, the blueprints for the British new towns such as Crawley in Sussex and Harlow in Essex. For example, when planners heard about new town blues, there was this problem called new town blues. Women got very depressed in these places because they were separated from their kin and there was nothing to do, and it was miles to the shops, there were nothing for children, so on and so forth. The only thing they could think of to do to make this better was to put kitchens at the front of the house so that women could look out of the window while they were doing the washing up. So Jacob's interest in women and children in the street was very new and refreshing. So I now, in the last part of my lecture, I want to move on to the concept of heterotopia, the concept of the city as a heterotopia, since this concept seems to me rather consistent with the subjective approach to urban living. Now, the concept heterotopia has become theoretically popular since the publication shortly before his death in 1984 by Michel Foucault of the text of a lecture of Other Spaces, it was called, which he had given in 1967. Now, the concept of heterotopia is pertinent to the kinds of pictures of city life I've just been discussing, because it theorizes the multifarious, subjective experience of urban life as the play of many different experiences and usages in a single space. Foucault defines the heterotopia as the opposite of utopia. A utopia, as I'll discuss later in another lecture, is an imaginary space created in literature. That's to say, it doesn't actually exist in the real world. And it's a perfect and perfectly coherent space. Heterotopias, by contrast, are actually existing locations, and they are precisely not orderly in the sense in which Foucault rightly suggests utopias are orderly. And in an article in a collection, Postmodern Cities and Spaces, edited by Sophie Watson and Catherine Gibson, published quite recently, a writer called Benjamin Ginocchio discusses this concept of heterotopia. And I think he's rightly quite critical of Foucault's use of the term. He says Foucault describes heterotopias as kind of counter sites. So going back to De Certeau, you could say they were sites of resistance. Foucault says they have one of two possible roles. Either their role is to create a space of illusion, or else, on the contrary, their role is to create a space that is other, another real space, as perfect, as meticulous, as well arranged as ours is messy, ill-constructed and jumbled. Well, I'll leave aside the second role because that to me seems precisely a description of utopia, not of heterotopia. I would have thought that it's heterotopia that is jumbled. So I simply disagree with Foucault's second definition. But Ginocchio has a slightly different problem with the first role as described by Foucault, a space of illusion, since he asks, how can a heterotopia be completely differentiated and outside all other real spaces, yet also relate to and exist within actually existing social space? Perhaps that's a slightly sort of nitpicking kind of point, but I think Ginocchio is right to feel that the term heterotopia has perhaps been taken up rather casually and uncritically by subsequent theorists. I think he's right, and yet he's wrong in a sense. The problem, he says, with the majority of these critical appropriations is that they simply adopt the mildly incongruous aspect of Foucault's inviting description. The heterotopia is invariably reified as a handy marker for a variety of centerless structures or an elastic postmodern plurality, thereby losing the disruptive, transient, contradictory, and transformative implications of what remains a far more fluid idea. And rereading that now, I'm not really even quite sure what he means. It seems to me that there's quite a similarity between those two things. But of course, where he is right is to suggest that Foucault's usages and definitions of the term heterotopia is not fully worked out. But unlike Ginocchio, I think that the way in which it's been taken up by others builds on the most useful part of Foucault's lecture, which is precisely, as actually I think is quite often the case with Foucault, the seductive and suggestive aspects of an idea. And I think the heterotopia is best seen as this sort of elastic postmodern plurality, but that it's also can be disruptive, transient, contradictory, etc. And I agree with Foucault when he discusses the heterotopia as a special kind of space, one that is capable of juxtaposing in a single real place several spaces, several sites that are in themselves incompatible. For me, that's the kind of core of the heterotopia, or the idea. As I say, I disagree with part of his exposition, and with some of the examples he gives, which again seem to contradict his own definition. For example, prisons and barracks, which seem to me to be more like negative utopias. And of course, in his own later writing on such total institutions, Foucault described mini-societies of surveillance and transparency intended to reform behaviour, which is surely what prisons and barracks are. They have none of this plurality and kind of being several different incompatible things at the same time, or not as I see it anyway. But anyway, I think the general idea of the heterotopia is a really rather fruitful one in helping us to conceptualize and theorize the uses certain groups of people make of certain kinds of given space. And I think one interesting example of a heterotopia, though perhaps in this rather loose sense that Ginocchio despises, is the cafe. Now, the cafe was traditionally a commercially determined space, perhaps neither public nor private, and yet both at the same time. And it was traditionally, and perhaps still is, or maybe again in the future, used for a variety of purposes that might indeed seem incompatible or at least divergent. In the 19th and early 20th century, at any rate, and perhaps still more recently, cafes were meeting places. They were also people's offices. In fact, I know one Czech dissident who habitually used the Café Slavia in Prague as his home from home, as his office, because he assumed that whereas his home telephone was tapped, the Czech secret police were too stupid to tap the cafe telephone, so that would be safe to use. So that became his telephone. That was where he met everybody and so on. And that would be partly veiled by the fact that lots of other people, of course, came in and out of the cafe. And that again, was very traditional under Napoleon III. In the Second Empire in France, there were cafes where dissidents habitually met. Cafes are also used, were also used as studies and libraries, as workplaces. Again, a famous example would be Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote large parts of some of her books in cafes. Earlier, they were a kind of home for many bohemians. They were warm, they were well lighted. You didn't really have to buy anything very much there. Just one cup of coffee would keep you going for the whole day. And they provided all sorts of benefits, such as a very wide range of newspapers. Ilya Ehrenberg describes how the Café Rotonde in Montparnasse provided paper for writers to write on. But above all, they were meeting places of an informal kind, where groups, both political and artistic groups, met regularly to discuss their ideas. So there were surrealist cafes, there were Dada cafes, there were expressionist cafes in Berlin and Munich and so on, anarchist cafes, and so on. And they would be all these things at the same time and more. I mean, obviously they were erotic meeting places. They were places where increasingly women could go on their own, though that could sometimes be a problem. But and they also, some people even slept in cafes. They were a place for homeless people. And in fact, Siegfried Kracauer, the German theorist, says precisely that. They were homes for the homeless. They were part of a whole culture. And I think that is a kind of, could possibly be an example of the heterotopia. And the sociologist Kevin Hetherington has written interestingly about the heterotopia in connection with a study of New Age travellers he's made. Now, he's, of course, not talking about urban society as such, but I think he makes a number of good general points. He starts off by quoting, I meant to bring it, but I forgot. He quotes the first page of Louis Aragon's Paris Peasant as a surrealist text, in which Aragon writes of these kind of lost sort of marginal places which people kind of make their own. And I think, again, that's very typical of a kind of heterotopic use of space, and of a bohemian use of space as well. And then he goes, having quoted this passage, he in which Aragon almost sees them as then becoming imbued with a kind of semi-religious kind of meaning, or spiritual meaning, perhaps would be the right way of looking at it. I mean, when in Paris Peasant, when Louis Aragon talks about the Café Certa, where the Surrealists met, everything in that cafe is sort of imbued with a kind of special meaning and symbolism. And it's meaningful also because it's a cafe that wasn't in any of the fashionable bohemian places like Montparnasse or Montmartre had been, and wasn't fashionable either. It was a kind of shabby place which the Surrealists imbued with a kind of magical importance and meaning. Writing about the New Age travellers, Hetherington says that marginal places have a social centrality that acts like a shrine to those who live outside the sanctioned values of society, because they symbolize another set of values and beliefs around which particular groups can organize the way they want to be identified. Marginal places become sites of social centrality for the reproduction of marginal identities, and I would say the strengthening of marginal identities. And he says the sorts of places likely to be chosen are marginal places whose meaning is ambivalent. As such, they will be taken as symbolic centres for marginal outgroups on the margins of society. Such places are liminal, that's to say, they are on thresholds or at the borders. They are on some border between one thing and another. And these marginal places are found on the margins or peripheries of inhabited areas and come to symbolize other different sets of beliefs and values. Heterotopias unsettle because they are out of place. Their juxtaposition to a settled representation makes them appear anomalous and uncertain, and they offer a new perspective on what is hidden among the ruins of bourgeois culture, fragments of past forgotten lives, found objects, strange unsettling things that have a poetic wonder about them. Heterotopic places are sought out by marginal people because they are perceived as sites which rupture the order of things, offering little cul-de-sacs or dead ends for them to perform acts of transgression in the production of other forms of identity. He says they are seen by Foucault as making local acts of resistance possible, but also function for Foucault as a means of ordering through difference and otherness. So thus, as modified by Hetherington, a heterotopia becomes a marginal place that can also, as he goes on to develop this in relation to New Agers, almost carnivalesque and sacred, and yet at the same time transgressive. And he goes on to talk about the whole history of Stonehenge and so on, which is not entirely relevant to us. But I think a kind of, perhaps a different kind of, a more relevant example might be the whole Tompkins Park saga on the Lower East Side. But anyway, heterotopias may be seen then as sites in which the acts of resistance De Certeau writes about may be practiced. One of the aspects of this resistance being that the heterotopic space is put to a use its creators did not intend, and which may be quite contrary to its intended purpose. And obviously what Hetherington is also interested in is the way in which this reinforces people's sense of identity. The marginal groups we may expect to find in such spaces are likely to be the dispossessed by reason of, among other things, race and gender, as well as poverty and class positioning. And again, although it wasn't an urban space, I think one could include the Greenham Common women's peace camps of the 1980s within a definition of heterotopia, and no doubt Newbury today. One could also perhaps include something very different, Andy Warhol's Factory of the 1960s, within the definition of heterotopia. In his factory, anything could happen, and all sorts of contradictory things did happen. And the heterotopia, as I conceive of it, would be a site that was livable and essentially friendly to women, gays, homeless people. But this is emphatically not the case, as I shall discuss next week and the week after, of the dystopia or the utopia. So I'll stop there. Thank you. No. I think you've got a question. Yeah. Well, I suppose this distinction between strategy and tactics is, I think, taken from theories about war. You know, strategy is something bigger and tactics is something more short-term. I mean, dancing could be a tactic, yes. I mean, lots of things could be a tactic. Yes, that's what he is talking about. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yes. Well, what do you think? That's rather an interesting question. I mean, what do you think?
I think it's a kind of bit.
Somebody did the two.
Because clearly utopias are
Totally intended. Yes.
the strongest examples of
Well, I suppose perhaps they start off by being unintentional, but then become more and more intentional, and then perhaps they become too intentional and get spoilt in a sense. You know, when something becomes commercialized, then it's spoilt, and all the real people move on to somewhere else. So I think I would think they started off by not meaning to be what they become, and then, you know, this chosen group chooses them. I think this whole thing about choosing is quite important, so that they then become, to the inner circle, to the, you know, those who are au fait with it, they become this kind of special place. But then that can become destroyed, well, often by consumption. You know, the original people can feel it's destroyed. Yeah. Well, possibly not. I'm not quite sure. I mean, this is just a free association, really. I mean, what comes to my mind is the GLC's initiative for the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, which was, I suppose, a sort of intended heterotopia in a sense. You know, it was supposed to be a multifunction place that would be nice, and it would be for a kind of oppressed or whatever group, you know, a minority group. And yet it never really sort of worked properly somehow, because you had to go there. You were sort of meant to be lesbian and gay to go there, and so somebody else, you know, in a way it's taken away. Somebody else has defined you then. Yeah. Yes. I'm not sure, really. Yeah. Mm. What, different from the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Yes. Well, I think actually the museum example is perhaps a rather trivial one. You know, maybe it doesn't really amount to anything much more than the cafe stayed open later in the evening or something. So, you know, as a slightly trivial point. But I think the whole way in which things get gentrified, I mean, that is a very long, persistent process, isn't it? And it does seem as if commercial, you know, there's this very peculiar relationship between these artistic coteries and commerce, which commerce wants, you know, they pride themselves on being deviant and different and so on and dissident, but somehow there's something about consumer culture which needs their ideas, so the ideas end up getting taken up very often, and part of that is the persistent gentrification of, you know, formerly kind of bohemian kind of parts of cities. I mean, you know, there are many, many examples of that, and I mean, I think Hackney is a recent example, really, you know, and before that there was Soho is slightly different, but I mean Chelsea and Hampstead and Fulham have obviously been all places that were once shabby artistic districts, you know, slightly seedy and so on, and now have become, you know, top-notch real estate. And the same is true of Greenwich Village, and now it's got down to sort of the Lower East Side and so on, and Tompkins Park was an example of that, you know, formerly inhabited by homeless people and so on, you know, and has now become, you know, in the whole of what's called Alphabet City, avenues A to D, you know, is a sort of flying bullets and drugs and so on, and now that's all getting gentrified then in slightly different ways. I mean, I think that's a very persistent tendency that, you know, commercial interests are attracted by this unusual kind of life which seeks to escape commercial. You know, these are people who are against the consumer society very often, and yet this curious kind of almost cannibalistic aspect of you know, industrial capitalism really kind of ends up with it being the opposite. So they're always moving on, you know. It's yes. Sorry, what space in Barcelona?
Transitional spaces that place on the edge of the city that are trying to be, you know, regain and unifying the city and suburbs of the city. Are they part of how can we classify them?
Well, I think possibly. I mean, I don't know. I'm not terribly familiar with Barcelona, but I think what Maspero was trying to do was perhaps try to reclaim these hideous suburbs as a kind of heterotopia, and indeed, you know, he does discuss in some detail all these different people in these suburbs, making different uses of them, including artists' colonies, in fact. And so I think, you know, and he writes of them as very diverse and contradictory places. You know, they're perceived from the outside as being, you know, the haunt of poverty and crime and drug addiction and, you know, unwelcome immigrants, etc., etc. It's perceived in a very racist way. But he describes something very different and lots of different things going on within them. So I think he would, you know, he doesn't use the word, but I think probably he would, his way of looking at these suburbs would be to see them as heterotopic in that way.
I don't mean about the suburbs, I mean about the transitions between Van de Brom by Edward Bloom is a park where he's trying to adjust an area relation between the different suburbs. And we're trying to do something.
Yes.
Something that
Yes, I see what you mean. Sorry, I sort of slightly misunderstood you. Well, but I think it would always have to come from the people themselves. I think once planners are trying to say, to do something, I mean, that would be the kind of implication of the term, wouldn't, or the way it's being discussed here, would be that this has to come from underneath. And once it comes from on top, it's kind of spoilt in some way. Isn't there some implication of that, I think? Possibly. Yeah. Yes. Mm. 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 Yeah. Yes. 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 I think that's true, probably. Yeah. Mm. Yes. I think, well, yes, I mean, I agree with what you said. I think that's true, although I think there always has to be a space that is then kind of sacralized, as it were. The nature of the space actually is immaterial in a way. I mean, it could be anywhere, I suppose. I mean, it could be one of these trains. It could be, you know, a bit of wasteland behind the railway or something. You know, that would... Yes, I think that's right. I think that's right.
I mean, in a sense, the question seems to, and it goes back to some of the earlier questions, the question is, in a sense, is there a relationship between heterotopia and kind of built form
Yeah.
As such? Or is heterotopia something which is a kind of social construction in a reaction, as a sort of reaction formation to build form? I suppose one could take kind of two views. On the one hand, it was nothing to do with built form. It was part of the sort of human response, whether it's kind of happy or unhappy, to the places it finds itself dumped in. Or one could say perhaps there are built forms which, if they don't materialize heterotopia, are certainly incredibly inimical to heterotopia. I mean, you know, the space of a barracks. I mean, it's not to say that in their resistance, the ingenuity of kind of common soldiers will construct heterotopic kind of maps of the place. But nonetheless, one would have to say that something like a prison or a barracks seemed pretty kind of inimical to the sort of discontinuous sociability of a kind of heterotopia. And it does seem like very difficult how one would move on from a kind of outline and a defense of heterotopia to trying
Yes.
So somewhere between the two, it needs to be kind of thought out.
I think I'd always assumed that there has to be some relation to a construction of some sort. I mean, so at one end you would have sort of Benders at Greenham Common, and at the other end you would have the cafe or something. You know, they're two very different kinds of... But there has to be something sort of built, which itself is... Well, I don't know whether a Bender is, but...
That while the Greenham is like, feels like a pure social reaction, that is to say,
Yeah.
it constructs its place out of the decision to construct it. By contrast, you know, the cafe, even if it too materializes aspects of Heterotopia, actually, you know, does have a history in a sense as a building type. I mean, not a very kind of ordinary one, but you know, it is there.
Yes, perhaps that's a better example of heterotopia. Perhaps Greenham Common is not a very good example. I'm beginning to feel it's not a very good example, really.
So we
Yes.
there was a question there. Then
I'm not sure I agree with you, actually, because I think if you take a scenario, for instance, whereby you go to work in an office every day and decide you want to make some personal resistance to that necessity to occupy the space in your office every day, and what you decide to do, because you couldn't absent yourself from the office, so you have to see going in there every day. What you can do is you can hang around on the telephone, talk to people, occupy the space next to the coffee machine, and basically do very little to contribute to what you're meant to be doing there. And then the architecture of the space, in many ways, doesn't really contribute to that, except to say that it's the context in which you can then occupy the space in a subversive way. But you could design the coffee machine and your relation, with your desk's relation to it, whereby you could then enact this subversion without necessarily being detected very well.
But I don't think... I mean, resistance isn't the same as heterotopia, is it? And I mean, I also think there has to be a collective aspect to the creation of a heterotopia. I mean, that's you resisting, and I think that's my problem with the barracks or the prison, you know, that resistance of itself doesn't turn a very transparent place with very obvious aims and so on into a heterotopia. There has to be something else about the I think there does have to be something about the location which is itself more fluid and perhaps less strictly defined. Well, I think in the way that Hetherington, following Aragon, talks about it, yes, it would. They would, you know, they define it in those terms. You know, here is a space that a group of people defines as sacred or special.
But it feels like in the case of the office, like there's a thin line between that kind of resistance and wasting your life. I mean, it's because... No. I mean, Foucault is very clear that certain forms of things which may feel like a resistance, for example, to a building or to an institution, are actually endemic to the strategy of the building.
Well, yes, exactly.
That
Yes,
is to say,
yeah.
by, you know, hanging around on the telephone, whatever, you know, a kind of, you know, it's certainly one way in which the system makes sure we're not kind of getting into trouble. So there was Peter at that.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I just think the example of
Yes. 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 Well, yes. And another thing that happened with the cafe was that often the managers and the waiters and the owners themselves ended up becoming part of the heterotopic community in a sense. I mean, it was more important to them as their life, Le Bien at the Café Rotonde. What was important to him was having all these artists there. He didn't like the art, but what was important was having the artists and being there. He didn't care about making a lot of money or anything. It was, so yes, I mean, that's just a...
I'd just like to ask whether you see the issue of the collective actor as being crucial to running one of the criticisms that's been directed towards the theories of marginality and choice
Mm.
and the other is it simply locates the other or maintains the position of powerlessness and demise
Mm.
of truth is something around which an architect of life is occurring exactly at a time when minorities live in so
Mm.
clamouring for their role in the kind of politics of power. How would you see the role of heterotopia in actually acting against the similarities that we still today have? How do you see its role in that scenario?
Well, it might or it might not. I mean, I don't think, I think it historically it often has, and I would say that the women's movement, say in the 1970s, did construct various heterotopic spaces. But that's because, I don't think the heterotopia creates the resistance, or it's more the other way around in a sense. If you don't have a movement or a group of people, it is unlikely that these spaces will be colonized, isn't it, really? And that's why I think the whole intentionality thing comes in. I don't know that you can set up. Well, I mean, I think that's where the London Lesbian Gay Centre does become a quite good example, really, because that was sort of set up deliberately as a place for people, in that sense, and it didn't really work.
How does heterotopia view the position of transitional, ephemeral marginality to actually inserting itself into the dominant order so that things can change? How do you stop it from just being a romantic, momentary spectacle, in the mosaic of the city?
Well, it depends. It would depend very much on external circumstances to some extent, wouldn't it? I mean, if you took the New Age traveller example, which isn't perhaps a very good example for this audience, something has happened which has meant that those groups are coming to play a different role in society and are ceasing to be, in a real sense, marginal, Another example would be in Munich, where a whole load of sort of people who spent their life in cafes and trying to organise prostitutes and this sort of thing suddenly found themselves the leaders of the Räterepublik in 1918, 1919, So it's partly determined by external experiences. I mean, a heterotopia or a movement of the oppressed or a little group of people who feel they're oppressed or feel marginal, all this can change, but that's part of a much wider situation. So one shouldn't sort of reify utopias as being a sort of a be-all and end-all, or as the beginning or the goal or the kind of the motor that is going to create something much bigger. I don't think that's necessarily the case at all. I think, people could go on sitting in cafes for years, and then something changes and they all change. But of course, if they hadn't been there, maybe the opportunity wouldn't have been seized. So, I mean, there's that whole aspect of it as well.